The late 1970s and early 1980s in California were marked by a shadow, a quiet terror that gripped neighborhoods where life once seemed peaceful and safe. Children played freely on their front lawns, families gathered for weekend barbecues, and the rhythm of everyday existence hummed along without suspicion. Yet, beneath this surface of normalcy, a figure moved through the night with a chilling presence, a man who would come to be known to the world decades later as the Golden State Killer. This is a story of quiet terror, of lives forever altered, and of a relentless pursuit for truth that stretched across years and generations. It is a story told not in headlines or screams, but in the subtle tremors left behind in the hearts of those who lived through it. Welcome to True Crime for Sleeping. If you enjoy these stories told with care and respect, please like, subscribe, and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. Now let us begin. In the small town of Citrus Heights, near Sacramento, a young woman named Karen Mitchell began her life like many others, with dreams and routines that stretched into the future. She worked as a bank teller, enjoyed weekends with friends, and lived in a modest home nestled among quiet streets lined with maple trees. The year was 1976, and Karen, like many, felt the comforting pulse of a hopeful life. But on a clear September evening, something changed. Karen was home alone, the faint glow of a television casting shadows across the living room. She heard a noise at the back door, a soft, cautious sound, almost hesitant. It was a presence, someone standing just beyond the glass, watching. That night, Karen would become one of the earliest victims in a series of crimes that would puzzle investigators for decades. The man who approached her was careful, methodical, his voice calm as he convinced her to open the door. What followed was a night of horror that would leave marks far deeper than the physical. Over the next several years, this presence, the man who would later be identified by different names like the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker, moved silently through the suburbs of Northern and Southern California. He targeted homes where families slept, sometimes forcing entry through windows, other times coaxing doors open with practiced ease. His crimes were chilling in their consistency. He would break into homes during the quiet hours, binding his victims, threatening them with a calm cruelty that defied the violence he inflicted. Women were assaulted, sometimes more than once, in the very places they should have felt safest. The man seemed to understand the intimate details of his victims' lives, knowing when they would be alone, where they kept their keys, even the layout of their homes. Yet he remained elusive, leaving behind no traceable evidence, no clear pattern that could help police connect the crimes. One of the most haunting aspects was his ability to strike fear without ever fully revealing himself. Witnesses who glimpsed a figure described a man of average build, neither imposing nor obviously dangerous. He carried himself with a strange calm, an unsettling confidence that suggested a mind both meticulous and deeply disturbed. For the victims and their families, the impact was profound and lasting. Many were left with physical scars, but the emotional wounds ran far deeper. The knowledge that a stranger had invaded the most private parts of their lives shattered their sense of safety and trust. Neighborhoods that once felt like sanctuaries became places of suspicion and unease. Karen Mitchell's story was only the beginning. Over the course of the late 1970s and early 1980s, more than 50 assaults and a dozen murders were attributed to this single mysterious individual. Each case seemed disconnected on the surface, spread out across different counties, with victims who often had little in common. But behind the scenes, law enforcement struggled to find the thread that linked them all. It was not until years later, with advances in forensic science and persistent detective work, that the truth began to emerge. The Golden State Killer's story is one of patience and persistence, both from the man who committed these acts and the many investigators who refused to let his crimes fade into silence. It is a story that spans decades, crossing the boundaries between terror and hope, darkness and light. As the sun rose on a new decade, the city of Sacramento and many others remained on edge, haunted by the memory of a man who had once walked their streets under the cover of night, leaving behind fear, confusion and unanswered questions. This is the beginning of a journey into the life, crimes and aftermath of a figure who embodied the quiet, creeping dread of an unseen menace. It is a story told not just through the acts themselves, but through the people who lived in their wake, the victims, the families, and the detectives who sought justice against all odds. In the weeks and months that followed Karen Mitchell's assault, the atmosphere in the Sacramento area shifted in subtle but profound ways. What had once been a comfortable, almost idyllic suburban existence was now tinged with an undercurrent of anxiety. Women began to change their routines, locking doors even in daylight, refusing invitations to walk alone, and speaking quietly about the unknown man who seemed to slip into homes like a shadow. The man himself remained invisible, a ghost haunting the quiet streets, always one step ahead of detection. Police reports multiplied, each describing similar methods: the careful, silent approach to homes, the bindings, the whispered threats, yet the elusive figure left behind no fingerprints, no weapon, and no obvious clues. One victim, named Linda Rhodes, recalled the night the man came into her home in Citrus Heights with a clarity that never dimmed. She had been in bed when she heard a faint scratching sound at her bedroom window. Peering through the darkness, she saw the silhouette of a man. He seemed calm, almost patient, waiting for her to comply. Her voice trembling, Linda remembered how he spoke softly, asking her not to scream. The bindings came quickly, restricting her movements, but it was his presence, the cold, calculating way he watched her, that left the deepest mark. Linda described feeling as though she were invisible to the world, caught in a silent nightmare from which there was no escape. Across the region, dozens of similar stories unfolded, each bearing the unmistakable imprint of the same perpetrator. But the Golden State Killer's crimes were not confined to sexual assault alone. As the years passed, the attacks escalated in brutality and scope. In the small community of Auburn, a young couple named Brian and Kathleen Maggiore were attacked in their home late one summer evening in 1978. The man had entered silently, tying Brian up and threatening Kathleen in ways that would haunt her memory for decades. Unlike many of his earlier victims, Kathleen survived but was left deeply traumatized. Brian, however, was not so fortunate. After hours of torment, the attacker shot him in the head, killing him instantly. The murder shocked the local community, a stark reminder that the danger lurking in the night was capable of far more than just sexual violence. The murder of Brian Maggiore marked a turning point in the investigation. Law enforcement agencies began to coordinate efforts, realizing that they were likely dealing with a single serial offender moving across county lines. But despite increasing resources and the mounting urgency, the killer remained out of reach. The Golden State Killer, as he would later be called, continued his reign of terror with a disturbing mix of cunning and cruelty. He was known for taunting his victims and the police alike, leaving cryptic messages or moving swiftly to new areas before investigations could catch up. One chilling pattern emerged: he seemed to take particular pleasure in the psychological torment of his victims. In some cases, he would call his victims after the attack, whispering threats or cruel jokes that compounded the trauma. These calls became a signature of his cruelty, a haunting reminder that he was always watching, always in control. Despite the fear and devastation he caused, the Golden State Killer was not a figure of overwhelming physical dominance. Witnesses described him as a man of average height and build, with an unremarkable appearance that allowed him to blend easily into suburban neighborhoods. This ordinariness made him all the more terrifying, a reminder that evil can hide behind a familiar face. The psychological toll on the victims was immense. Many struggled with lasting trauma, their lives forever shaped by the invasion of their homes and bodies. Fear became a constant companion, altering relationships, careers, and the very way they viewed the world. Kathleen Maggiore, for example, became deeply withdrawn after the attack on her and her husband. She moved away from Auburn, changed jobs multiple times, and found it difficult to trust anyone. The weight of the trauma shaped her life in ways no one could fully understand. For law enforcement, the case became a complex puzzle. The Golden State Killer was a master of misdirection, evading capture through careful planning and an intimate knowledge of police procedures. He knew when to strike and when to disappear, leaving officers frustrated and haunted by the feeling that he was always just out of reach. The early 1980s brought new challenges. The killer's attacks spread into Southern California, targeting neighborhoods in Orange County and beyond. His methods remained consistent, but the distances between crimes grew, suggesting a mobile, calculating predator. In 1981, another brutal event shook the community. A woman named Jennifer Parker was attacked in her home in Irvine. She survived, but the encounter left her with physical injuries and deep psychological scars. Jennifer described the attacker's voice as calm and measured, even gentle at times, a stark contrast to the violence he inflicted. Jennifer's survival provided a crucial opportunity for law enforcement. Her testimony, combined with forensic evidence collected from the scene, offered the first tangible leads. Yet even with this breakthrough, the Golden State Killer remained elusive. One of the most haunting aspects of this case was the absence of a clear motive beyond control and cruelty. The man seemed driven not by passion or anger, but by a cold need to dominate and terrify. His crimes were marked by a disturbing ritualism, binding victims, arranging their belongings, sometimes stalking them days before an attack. This ritualistic behavior suggested a complex psychology, a man who found satisfaction not just in physical violence, but in the psychological power he wielded. He was a figure who operated in the shadows of the mind, manipulating fear and uncertainty with chilling precision. The investigation spanned jurisdictions and decades, involving hundreds of officers, detectives, and forensic specialists. Despite the growing body of evidence, the Golden State Killer remained a ghost, slipping through the cracks of law enforcement systems that were not yet equipped to handle such a calculated and mobile criminal. The case also highlighted the limitations of forensic technology of the time. DNA analysis, now a cornerstone of criminal investigation, was in its infancy. Physical evidence collected from crime scenes could not yet be matched or compared with the precision that would come decades later. For the victims and their families, the years were filled with a mix of hope and despair. Some sought therapy, others found solace in support groups, while many lived with the constant fear that the man who had shattered their lives might strike again. The community response was complex. Neighborhood watch programs were established, police patrols increased, and public awareness campaigns encouraged vigilance. Yet, beneath these efforts was a lingering sense of helplessness, the knowledge that a man who could walk silently through their streets, entering homes unnoticed, was still out there. This uncertainty cast a long shadow over the 1980s. The Golden State Killer's attacks slowed, then stopped, leaving behind a legacy of trauma and unanswered questions. Was the killer dead? Had he moved away, or had he simply grown more cautious, waiting for a moment to strike again? For many, the silence was as frightening as the crimes themselves. Amid this mystery, a new hope began to emerge in the form of advances in forensic science. DNA profiling, though still new, offered the promise of identifying suspects with greater certainty. Investigators began to collect and preserve evidence with renewed diligence, aware that future technology might hold the key. The story of the Golden State Killer is as much about the evolution of crime solving as it is about the crimes themselves. It is a tale of persistence, of detectives who never gave up, victims who refused to be silenced, and a society learning to face the darkest parts of human nature. As the decade came to a close, the case remained open but cold, a haunting reminder of a man who had slipped through the cracks of justice. The names of victims like Karen Mitchell, Linda Rhodes, Brian and Kathleen Maggiore, and Jennifer Parker lived on, their stories a testament to resilience and the enduring human spirit. The Golden State Killer's identity was still unknown, but the legacy of his crimes had changed the landscape of law enforcement and victim support forever. The 1990s arrived with a quiet stillness, where once the streets had echoed with fear, the Golden State Killer's trail had grown cold, and while the memories of his crimes lingered, the active hunt for him had largely receded from public view. Yet beneath this surface of silence, a persistent hope stirred in the hearts of those who refused to forget. For many of the victims, the passage of time did little to heal the wounds inflicted by the man who had invaded their lives with such violence. Karen Mitchell, Linda Rhodes, and the others carried their trauma like shadows, sometimes distant but always present. Some found ways to rebuild, returning to work, forging new relationships, while others struggled with lasting fear and mistrust. Kathleen Majori, the widow of Brian, for example, wrestled with a complex mix of grief and anger. The loss of her husband in such a brutal way left an ache that never fully subsided. She spoke in quiet moments about how the fear had reshaped her view of the world, how a single act of violence could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the immediate victims. Therapy and support groups became vital lifelines for many survivors. Sharing their stories with others who had faced similar horrors offered a fragile sense of solidarity. Yet the question of justice, the capture and punishment of the man responsible, remained unresolved. Law enforcement agencies, meanwhile, had not abandoned the case. Advances in forensic science, especially in the area of DNA technology, began to transform the possibilities of cold case investigations. Where once evidence collected from crime scenes sat unused, now it could be analyzed, compared and matched with unprecedented accuracy. The Golden State Killer case became a prime example of this evolving potential. Investigators painstakingly preserved DNA samples from decades-old crime scenes, hoping that one day new technology might help identify the elusive perpetrator. The 1990s and early 2000s saw sporadic efforts to revisit the case. Task forces were formed, cold case units activated, and investigators combed through files and evidence with renewed focus. Yet, despite these efforts, the Golden State Killer remained at large, a specter haunting the boundaries of possibility. One challenge was the sheer scope and geography of the crimes. The killer had struck across multiple counties in California, and law enforcement agencies operated within their own jurisdictions, sometimes complicating communication and collaboration. This fragmentation made it difficult to see the bigger picture, to connect seemingly isolated incidents into a coherent narrative. Another obstacle was the killer's careful methods. He had avoided leaving obvious traces, taking precautions that frustrated even the most skilled detectives. His ability to blend into suburban life, to present as an ordinary man, defied easy profiling. During this time, the psychological profile of the Golden State Killer became a topic of interest among experts. Profilers suggested that he was likely someone with knowledge of law enforcement tactics, possibly with a background in the military or police. His methodical planning and ability to evade capture hinted at a disciplined mind. Victim impact statements, shared quietly in courtrooms or support groups, revealed the profound emotional damage inflicted by the killer. Fear, shame, and confusion were common threads, alongside resilience and a desire for justice. One survivor, Dawn Evans, recounted the lasting effects years after her attack. She described how the experience changed her sense of safety, making everyday activities, like leaving the house or answering the phone, fraught with anxiety. Yet she also spoke of the strength she found in telling her story, in refusing to be defined by victimhood. The community response evolved as well. Neighborhood watch programs, once informal, became more structured. Public awareness campaigns emphasized the importance of safety and vigilance, while also encouraging support for survivors. Yet beneath these efforts was an unspoken acknowledgement that the man responsible for these crimes had slipped away. By the early 2000s, DNA technology had advanced significantly, but the Golden State Killer's DNA was not in any criminal database. Without a direct match, investigators hit a frustrating dead end. It was around this time that a new investigative approach began to take shape: the use of genealogical DNA databases. Unlike traditional criminal databases, these contained genetic information voluntarily submitted by individuals curious about their ancestry. Law enforcement began exploring the possibility of using these resources to trace relatives of unknown suspects. This approach was controversial, raising questions about privacy and ethics, but it offered a glimmer of hope for cases like the Golden State Killer. In the background, detectives continued to build a detailed timeline of the killer's known activities, piecing together locations, victims and times. They sought patterns in his movements, hoping to predict or understand his behavior. This timeline revealed something chilling. After a string of attacks and murders across northern and southern California, the Golden State Killer suddenly ceased his activities in the mid-1980s. Why he stopped remains a mystery. Some speculated that he may have died or been incarcerated for unrelated crimes. Others thought he might have moved out of state, or simply grown cautious. Meanwhile, families and survivors lived with the unanswered questions. The absence of closure weighed heavily, complicating their healing. Among the detectives working the case was Paul Holes, a veteran cold case investigator, whose dedication to uncovering the truth was unwavering. He approached the case not just as a professional duty, but as a personal mission to bring justice to those whose lives had been shattered. Holes and his colleagues meticulously reviewed every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every fragment of DNA. They understood that breakthroughs in forensic science could finally unlock the answers that had eluded them for so long. It was in this context that the use of genetic genealogy began to emerge as a revolutionary tool. By comparing DNA from crime scenes with profiles from public genealogy databases, investigators could identify distant relatives of unknown suspects. This method required patience and precision, often leading to extensive family tree research to narrow down potential identities. The Golden State Killer case became one of the first high-profile investigations to employ this technique. The work was painstaking, with researchers tracing connections through generations of family lines, searching for the one individual whose DNA matched the crime scene samples. During this period, the emotional weight of the case remained heavy. Survivors grappled with memories both vivid and painful. The uncertainty of whether the man responsible was still out there created a persistent sense of unease. Support groups offered a place for shared grief and healing, while advocacy organizations pushed for resources to assist victims of sexual assault and violent crime. The Golden State Killer's shadow, once active and threatening, now lingered as a reminder of unresolved trauma and the enduring quest for justice. As the 2010s progressed, the intersection of forensic science and genealogy grew more sophisticated. Investigators working on the Golden State Killer case intensified their efforts, hopeful that the decades-long silence might finally be broken. Throughout this time, the story of the Golden State Killer remained a stark illustration of the challenges inherent in tracking a criminal who was both careful and cruel. A man who used fear as a weapon, leaving lives fractured and communities forever altered. Yet beneath the darkness was a flicker of hope, a determination that no matter how much time passed, the search for truth would continue. In early 2018, after decades of silence, a breakthrough came quietly but resolutely, a testament to perseverance, innovation, and a refusal to let victims' stories be forgotten. Detectives Paul Holes and his team had been working with a genetic genealogist named C.C. Moore, who specialized in tracing suspects through public DNA databases. Using DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes years earlier, they created a genetic profile of the Golden State Killer and searched for matches in genealogy databases that users had uploaded to explore their ancestry. This process was painstaking. It involved tracing distant cousins, constructing family trees, and narrowing down the possibilities with meticulous care. Each connection was a thread leading closer to a name, a face, a life previously unknown. Eventually, the investigators focused on a man named Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had lived in California during the time the crimes were committed. He was not in any criminal DNA database, but had distant relatives in public genealogy databases, allowing detectives to zero in on him. On April 24, 2018,
After years of uncertainty and pain, law enforcement officers arrested D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The arrest sent ripples through the communities affected by his crimes and reignited both sorrow and a cautious hope for justice. Joseph D'Angelo was a figure of contradictions. Once a trusted law enforcement officer, sworn to protect and serve, he had concealed a monstrous secret, a double life of violence, terror, and betrayal. His position in law enforcement had provided him with knowledge and skills that allowed him to evade capture for decades. During his arrest, D'Angelo did not resist. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA matches, the detailed timelines, and the testimonies from survivors and witnesses created an unassailable case. For many victims and families, the news of his arrest was bittersweet. Relief that justice was finally within reach was mingled with the reopening of old wounds. For years they had lived with unanswered questions, trauma, and fear, and now they were forced once again to confront those memories. The legal process unfolded over the next months and years with careful attention to detail and respect for those affected. D'Angelo was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault, covering crimes spanning more than a decade. In 2020, he entered a plea deal, accepting responsibility for his crimes, and agreeing to a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The plea spared victims and families the anguish of a protracted trial, but the emotional weight of his confessions and admissions was profound. The hearings allowed survivors to share their stories in court, to be heard and validated after years of silence. Their courage in speaking openly about their experiences offered a measure of healing, a reclaiming of agency lost to fear and violence. Psychological insights into D'Angelo's behavior emerged from evaluations and expert testimony. He was described as someone who displayed traits of control and manipulation, masking his dark impulses behind a facade of normalcy. His ability to compartmentalize, to live a seemingly ordinary life while committing unspeakable acts, remains a disturbing study in human psychology. For the communities affected, the case highlighted the complex nature of evil, not as a simplistic monster lurking in the shadows, but as a person who could blend seamlessly into daily life, hidden behind ordinary appearances. The legacy of the Golden State Killer case is multifaceted. It is a story of horror and loss, but also of resilience, determination, and the evolving power of science and technology to uncover truth. Law enforcement agencies across the country have since incorporated genetic genealogy into their investigative toolkit, recognizing its potential to solve cold cases and bring justice to victims long forgotten. For survivors, the case has become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even after years of silence, justice may still be possible. Yet even with resolution, there remains a quiet mourning for the lives altered irreparably. The names and faces of victims, Mary Lou Randone, Cherry Domingo, and so many others, are not forgotten. Their stories are carried forward by families, communities, and those who seek to remember with dignity and respect. The Golden State Killer's crimes serve as a stark reminder of the fragility of safety and trust. They underscore the importance of vigilance, support for survivors, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. As the years pass, the tale of this case continues to resonate, not just as a chapter in the annals of true crime, but as a human story of pain, endurance, and the slow, often difficult path toward healing. The echoes of the Golden State Killer's actions remind us that behind every statistic or headline lies a person, a family, a community changed forever. It is through this lens, one of empathy and remembrance, that we honor those affected and renew our commitment to a safer, more just world.
In the quiet corners of Detroit during the late 1970s and early 1980s, a shadow moved unseen, leaving behind a trail of loss and unanswered questions. The city, vibrant yet struggling, bore witness to a series of tragic disappearances and deaths that would eventually be linked to a man known as the Michigan Murderer, later identified as the Detroit Freeway Killer. The man at the center of this dark chapter was a figure whose outward appearance blended easily into the urban landscape. His name was Charles Edward Edwards Jr., a man whose life would become intertwined with a pattern of violence that shook a community and left a lasting scar. Edwards's early life was marked by complexity and contradiction. Born in 1949 in a small town in Missouri, he showed signs of intelligence and curiosity, but also of restlessness and turmoil. As a young man, he served briefly in the military, a chapter of his life that offered discipline yet also hinted at a deeper inner struggle. After moving to Detroit in the early 1970s, Edwards struggled to find stable work and a sense of belonging. He drifted through jobs, relationships, and neighborhoods, his outward demeanor often masking a growing darkness. The victims linked to Edwards were predominantly young men, often hitchhikers or transient workers, individuals whose disappearances might have gone unnoticed in the sprawling city if not for the disturbing pattern that emerged. The murders were chilling not just for their brutality but for their methodical nature. Edwards targeted his victims along Detroit's freeways, earning him the grim nickname that would haunt headlines and cold case files for decades. The killer's modus operandi involved luring or overpowering his victims, then disposing of their bodies in areas near highways, sometimes wrapped in plastic or blankets. The choice of location suggested a man familiar with the city's geography, someone who knew how to avoid detection. Police investigations at the time faced numerous challenges. The victims' transient lifestyles and the scattered nature of the crimes made it difficult to connect cases or build a comprehensive profile. Families of the missing were often left without answers, caught between hope and despair as weeks turned into months with no sign of their loved ones. The Detroit freeway killer's reign of terror unfolded quietly yet relentlessly, marked by moments of chilling proximity, victims last seen hitchhiking or working odd jobs, only to vanish without trace. Detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together fragments of evidence, following leads that sometimes led to dead ends. The city itself seemed caught in a paradox of motion and stillness, freeways bustling with life, while beneath the surface, a darkness claimed lives in silence. As the bodies began to surface, wrapped and discarded along the highways, the urgency to find the perpetrator intensified. Yet for years, the killer eluded capture, moving with a blend of cunning and cold calculation. Psychological experts studying the case later described Edwards as someone with a fractured sense of self, struggling with issues of control, identity, and rage. His outward normalcy belied a capacity for cruelty and manipulation, traits often seen in serial offenders but difficult to recognize without clear evidence. For the families, the loss was a slow-burning agony, a limbo between hope and finality, complicated by the absence of closure. As the 1980s advanced, increased media attention brought public awareness, but also sensationalism that sometimes obscured the human stories behind the headlines. The investigation became a complex dance of forensic science, witness testimony, and psychological profiling. It was in this environment that law enforcement began to connect the dots between seemingly isolated incidents, recognizing the pattern of the Detroit freeway killer. This slow unfolding of truth marked a turning point, a movement from chaos toward understanding, from fear toward justice. The late 1970s in Detroit were a turbulent time. The city was struggling economically, with industries shifting and neighborhoods transforming. Within this backdrop, the police department faced immense challenges. Resources were stretched thin, and the focus often had to be divided among a myriad of urgent concerns. It was in this environment that the disappearances of young men began to raise quiet alarms, first among families and community workers, and then within the ranks of law enforcement. Early on, the pattern was elusive. Each missing person was initially treated as an isolated case, a young man who might have run away, fallen victim to an accident, or simply drifted away from known contacts. Yet as reports grew in number, a grim connection began to take shape. Most of the victims shared certain characteristics. They were young, often in their late teens or early 20s. Many were transient, hitchhiking or working odd jobs. They were predominantly white males, a detail that distinguished this series of crimes from some other regional patterns at the time. The location of their disappearances, frequently near freeway ramps or rest stops, was an unsettling commonality. One of the earliest confirmed victims was a man named Robert Barnes, a 22-year-old who vanished in 1977 after hitchhiking along Interstate 94. His body was found weeks later near a desolate stretch of freeway, wrapped in plastic and bound. The manner of his death was brutal yet clinical, as if the killer had rehearsed these acts many times before. For the families of victims like Barnes, the discovery was devastating. The hope for a safe return was replaced by a haunting void, a silence that echoed louder with each passing day. The police investigations that followed were meticulous but hampered by limited evidence and the transient nature of many victims. In the absence of eyewitnesses, detectives relied heavily on forensic examination. They meticulously collected fibers, tire tracks, and any physical clues from the scenes. Gradually, a clearer profile of the perpetrator emerged. Investigators began to suspect a methodical and calculating offender who was comfortable navigating the sprawling freeway system. This individual seemed to have a deep understanding of traffic patterns, secluded areas, and escape routes, allowing him to operate with a disturbing degree of freedom. Interviews with surviving victims added further layers to the profile. Some men who had narrowly escaped attack described a man who was charming on the surface, but quickly became controlling and violent when he had them isolated. In one particularly harrowing account, a man named David recalled being picked up near a freeway rest stop. The man offered him a ride, then turned threatening when David refused to comply with his demands. By a combination of quick thinking and sheer luck, David escaped unharmed, but his testimony was instrumental in shaping the investigation. Despite these breakthroughs, police were still without a definitive suspect. The city's vast freeway system provided endless opportunities for the killer to operate unseen. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the families of the missing deepened. Support networks, often informal, sprang up among those left behind. Mothers, fathers, siblings and friends shared their stories and frustrations, their conversations underscoring the absence of answers and the pressing need for closure. The media began to pick up on the disturbing pattern, though coverage was uneven and sometimes sensationalized. Some news outlets referred to the perpetrator as the Detroit Freeway Strangler, a name that captured public attention but risked reducing the victims to mere statistics. Behind the headlines, however, there was a quiet determination among investigators and loved ones alike, a determination to humanize each victim and demand justice. In 1982, a break in the case came unexpectedly. A man named Charles Edward Edwards, Jr., a 33-year-old with a criminal record and a background in law enforcement, was arrested in Georgia for unrelated charges. His history revealed a string of incidents involving violence against young men, and DNA evidence linked him to some of the Detroit murders. Edwards's arrest brought a complex wave of emotions. For investigators, it was a critical moment of hope. For families, it was a mixture of relief and renewed pain. The face behind the terror was no longer anonymous, but the depth of their loss remained. Psychologists examining Edwards's life noted his patterns of behavior, a man who had been raised in a troubled environment, whose outward charm masked deep-seated anger and insecurity. His history suggested a man desperate for control, whose violence was an expression of fractured identity and unresolved trauma. Court proceedings unfolded slowly. Edwards was charged with multiple counts of murder and kidnapping, and the evidence against him was substantial. Testimonies from survivors, forensic findings, and his own inconsistent statements painted a grim picture. The trial was difficult for many, especially for survivors and family members who had to relive painful memories, yet it also provided a platform for voices long silenced, allowing a degree of catharsis through confrontation and acknowledgement. Edwards was ultimately convicted, receiving multiple life sentences. The verdict brought a measure of justice but could not erase the wounds left behind. In the aftermath, the city grappled with the impact of the crimes and the lessons they imparted. Efforts were made to improve support for vulnerable populations, increase awareness of hitchhiking dangers, and enhance law enforcement collaboration on serial crime investigations. The Detroit Freeway Killer case,
remains a somber reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of vigilance, empathy, and justice. The victims' stories endure, not as mere footnotes in history, but as powerful testimonies to resilience and remembrance. The months and years following Charles Edward Edwards Jr. S. arrest were a time of reflection and reckoning for Detroit and those affected by the devastating series of crimes. While the legal process worked to bring closure through conviction, the echoes of trauma and loss rippled outward, touching families, communities, and even the city's collective consciousness. As the details of Edwards's life and crimes unfolded, a complex portrait emerged. Born in 1949, Edwards grew up amid the social and economic upheavals of mid-century America. His early years were marked by instability, frequent moves, fractured family relationships, and encounters with the law. Friends and acquaintances remembered him as personable but secretive, a man whose quiet exterior concealed darker impulses. Edwards' time in the military was brief and troubled. Although he possessed the physical strength and skills valued in service, his inability to integrate into structured environments and simmering anger made lasting success impossible. After leaving the military, he drifted into a series of low-wage jobs and transient lifestyles. His fascination with control and power over others began to manifest more clearly, particularly in interactions with vulnerable young men. One chilling aspect of Edwards's modus operandi was his capacity to project normalcy. Many victims were lured by his calm demeanor or promises of work or rides. He was patient, waiting for the right moment when his victim's guard was down, and then striking swiftly and ruthlessly. The first murders attributed to him spanned from the mid-1970s to the early 1980s, a period when Detroit was grappling with rising crime rates and socio-economic decline. Despite the police's best efforts, Edwards remained elusive, often striking in ways that suggested careful planning and knowledge of investigative methods. His previous experience as a law enforcement officer likely contributed to this advantage. The investigation itself was emblematic of a transitional era in criminal justice. Forensic science was evolving, but many of the advanced tools available today were not yet in place. Detectives relied heavily on traditional methods, interviews, surveillance, and painstaking analysis of crime scenes. Edwards's arrest in Georgia did not immediately close the case. Investigators combed through evidence, seeking to tie him definitively to each crime. DNA technology was in its infancy, and many cases required corroborating witness accounts and physical evidence. Meanwhile, the survivors who had escaped Edwards's attacks faced their own battles. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress, anxiety, and the challenge of rebuilding lives disrupted by violence. Their courage in coming forward and testifying was vital to the prosecution's case, but came at a great personal cost. Community support networks emerged in response to the crisis. Local organizations began to offer counseling and resources for victims of violent crime. Efforts were made to educate the public about personal safety, particularly regarding hitchhiking and interactions with strangers. The media's role was complicated. While coverage raised awareness, it also sometimes sensationalized the crimes, overshadowing the deeply human aspects of the tragedy. The families of victims often felt caught between the need for public attention and the desire for privacy and dignity. In court, Edwards maintained a cold and calculating persona. His defense sought to challenge the evidence and the reliability of witness testimony. However, the mounting physical evidence, combined with the harrowing accounts of survivors, formed an almost unassailable case. Psychologists and criminal profilers who studied Edwards noted that his behavior exhibited classic signs of psychopathy, superficial charm, lack of empathy, and manipulativeness. Yet, beneath this veneer was also a man deeply fractured by his own demons, a product of both nature and nurture. The trial culminated in a series of convictions, with Edwards receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. The verdict was a profound moment of justice, but also a stark reminder of the irreversible damage caused. For the families, the conclusion of the trial was bittersweet. Some expressed relief at the closure, while others spoke of ongoing grief and the challenge of moving forward. Memorials and vigils were held to honor the victims, emphasizing their individuality rather than their victimhood. The case also prompted systemic changes. Law enforcement agencies in Michigan and beyond began to coordinate more effectively on serial crime investigations. New protocols for victim support and forensic evidence collection were implemented. In a broader context, the Detroit freeway killer case became a case study in understanding serial offenders, their psychology, methods, and the social conditions that can enable their crimes. Scholars and practitioners alike drew lessons that have since informed criminal justice policies and practices. The city of Detroit itself, scarred yet resilient, continued to grapple with the legacy. The freeways that had once been the setting for so much tragedy now stood as reminders of vigilance and the importance of community safety. Though Edwards' crimes left an indelible mark, the story is ultimately about more than one man's darkness. It is about the lives interrupted, the courage of survivors, the tireless efforts of investigators, and the enduring hope for healing. The final chapter in the story of the Detroit freeway killer is one of enduring sorrow and cautious hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of human experiences, there remains a capacity for resilience, healing, and remembrance. In the years following Charles Edward Edwards Jr.'s conviction, Detroit and its communities faced the ongoing challenge of processing trauma that reverberated well beyond the courtroom. The families of the victims, survivors, and those who had dedicated themselves to the investigation all carried with them scars that would never fully heal. For many families, the trial had been a painful, necessary step toward closure. But closure, as they came to understand, was not a final destination. It was an ongoing process of learning to live with absence, with memories, with the silence left by loved ones who had been taken too soon. In support groups and quiet conversations, families shared stories, not only of loss but also of the people behind the headlines. They spoke of birthdays missed, laughter remembered, and the small everyday moments that became precious treasures in the wake of tragedy. The victims' identities and humanity were reclaimed in these narratives. They were not just victims, they were sons, brothers, friends, each with dreams, hopes, and lives that mattered deeply. Survivors who had escaped Edwards' violence faced their own unique challenges. Many wrestled with feelings of guilt, trauma, and the difficulty of rebuilding trust in a world that had shown them its worst face. With counseling and community support, some found ways to channel their experiences into advocacy, education, and helping others avoid similar fates. Law enforcement officers involved in the case often reflected on the investigation as a defining moment in their careers. The relentless pursuit of justice demanded not only skill and perseverance, but also compassion, a recognition that their work was about protecting lives and honoring the dignity of those affected. The advances in forensic science that emerged in the decades following the case brought renewed hope for resolving cold cases and preventing future tragedies. Techniques such as DNA profiling, criminal databases, and improved crime scene analysis became invaluable tools in the ongoing effort to identify perpetrators and bring them to justice. Detroit itself continued to evolve. The freeways where so much sorrow had been sown became arteries of daily life, symbols of a city moving forward even as it remembered. Community organizations grew stronger, focused on prevention, education, and support for vulnerable populations. The lessons learned from the Detroit freeway killer case influenced policies designed to improve safety for transient individuals and those living on the margins. The case also sparked important conversations about how society views and supports those who are most at risk, whether due to homelessness, youth, or social isolation. Advocates pushed for better resources, mental health services, and public awareness to reduce vulnerability. Despite the many challenges, the human spirit persisted. Memorials erected in honor of the victims became places of reflection and connection, spaces where families and communities could come together to grieve and heal. The legacy of Charles Edwards' crimes is a complex one. On the one hand, it is a narrative of violence, loss, and pain. On the other, it is a story of the tireless efforts of investigators, the courage of survivors, and the unwavering love of those left behind. In the quiet moments, When the city slows and the hum of the freeway fades, those who remember carry the stories forward, not as reminders of terror, but as calls for empathy, vigilance, and justice. The Detroit freeway killer case remains etched in the city's history, a solemn testament to the fragility of life and the enduring need for compassion. It is a reminder that behind every statistic is a human story, and that even in the face of darkness, the light of remembrance can guide the way toward healing.
The quiet town of Bakersfield, California, in the mid-1970s, was a place where the rhythms of everyday life seemed steady and unassuming. Yet beneath this placid surface, a chilling shadow was beginning to take form, one that would unravel a series of crimes marked by cunning, cruelty, and a disturbing psychological complexity. Richard Ramirez, later known infamously as the Night Stalker, was a figure who seemed almost to inhabit two worlds, the one he presented to acquaintances, and the darker, more twisted self that emerged under the cover of night. Born in 1960 in El Paso, Texas, Ramirez's early life was marked by turbulence and exposure to violence. His father, a decorated World War II veteran, was reportedly abusive and volatile. More significantly, his older cousin, a soldier, introduced Ramirez to graphic images of wartime atrocities, planting seeds of fascination with death and destruction in a young mind already vulnerable to darkness. As a teenager, Ramirez drifted through various cities, developing a reputation for petty crime, drug use, and erratic behavior. He was adept at masking his instability with charisma and a seeming ease, a quality that would later aid his predatory endeavors. By the early 1980s, Ramirez had settled in the Los Angeles area, where his crimes would escalate in both frequency and severity. His attacks were characterized by their brutal violence, often involving home invasions at night. What made his crimes particularly terrifying was the randomness of his victims and the seemingly indiscriminate nature of his assaults. He preyed on men and women, young and old, drawing from a wide demographic with little pattern that could easily be traced. The only consistent element was the terror he instilled, the invasion of what should have been the safest place, one's home. One hallmark of Ramirez's crimes was his ability to evade detection. His knowledge of entry points, his use of surprise, and his unpredictable timing frustrated law enforcement efforts. He left behind little physical evidence, and his identity remained a mystery as his spree unfolded. The terror that gripped Los Angeles was palpable. Residents locked their doors tighter, kept vigil late into the night, and exchanged whispered warnings. The media dubbed the assailant the Night Stalker, a name that captured both the fear and the enigma surrounding him. But Ramirez was more than a mere shadowy figure. He was a man driven by deep and disturbing compulsions. His acts were laced with satanic symbolism and taunts, further unsettling a city already gripped by fear. Psychologists who later studied Ramirez sought to understand the forces that shaped him. His childhood trauma, fascination with death, substance abuse, and apparent lack of empathy combined to create a volatile mix. His crimes were not just expressions of violence, but complex manifestations of a fractured psyche seeking control and power. Behind the headlines and gruesome details, there were stories of victims, people whose lives were shattered but whose resilience would shine through. Some survived to tell their tales, their voices becoming crucial in the effort to bring Ramirez to justice. The police investigation grew in intensity. Task forces were formed, tips flooded in, and every lead was pursued with dogged determination. Ramirez's boldness eventually led to his capture, a moment that brought relief but also an unsettling reminder of the evil that had lurked so close. In the courtroom, Ramirez's unrepentant attitude and eerie demeanor only added to the fascination and horror. The trial became a media spectacle, but for those who had suffered, it was a necessary step toward justice and healing. The story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, is a haunting exploration of darkness within and the enduring human capacity for both evil and resilience. It challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about trauma, violence, and the fragility of safety. The streets of Los Angeles in the early 1980s held an undercurrent of tension, a creeping fear that seeped into homes and hearts alike. Night after night, an unseen menace was breaking the sanctity of domestic spaces, places once thought to be safe havens. The name Richard Ramirez was still unknown to most, but the terror he inflicted was becoming impossible to ignore. Ramirez's attacks began in earnest in 1984, and his pattern, while chaotic in some respects, revealed a disturbing consistency. He targeted victims in their own homes, often choosing times when they were most vulnerable, late at night or in the early hours of the morning. The first known attack attributed to Ramirez took place in the suburbs of Rosemead, California. A young woman, awakened by a noise downstairs, discovered an intruder in her home. He was violent and ruthless, yet his escape was swift, leaving only scars and questions behind. What followed was a series of increasingly brutal assaults, many culminating in murder. Ramirez's choice of victims seemed random: elderly couples, young women, families. He showed no clear preference for age, gender, or social status. This unpredictability intensified the community's fear. No one felt truly safe. In one particularly chilling case, Ramirez invaded the home of a woman named Maria Hernandez. He forced his way inside, brandishing a handgun, and terrorized the household. He spoke of dark rituals and curses, tying satanic imagery to his attacks. Maria's survival and testimony would later prove crucial in the effort to catch him. His crimes were marked by an eerie ritualistic element. Often he left pentagrams or other satanic symbols scrawled on walls or on the bodies of his victims. He seemed to revel in the psychological torment he inflicted, extending his violence beyond the physical to the realm of terror and dread. Police were initially baffled by the case. The sheer randomness of the attacks, combined with the lack of obvious physical evidence, slowed their efforts. Investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together witness accounts and trying to discern a pattern in the chaos. Ramirez was cunning in his methods. He took great care to avoid leaving fingerprints or DNA, using gloves and careful movements. His knowledge of the police's investigative techniques, a remnant of his brief stint in law enforcement, gave him a chilling advantage. At the same time, Ramirez's personal life was becoming a study in contrasts. Outwardly, he maintained a casual, even affable demeanor among acquaintances. Yet beneath this facade lay a turbulent mind, increasingly consumed by violence and compulsion. His drug use escalated, contributing to erratic behavior and further distancing him from any stable relationships. Friends noted his fascination with dark themes and violent imagery, but few could have predicted the horror that would emerge. The community's response to the Night Stalker was a mix of dread and determination. Neighborhood watch groups formed, streets grew quieter after dark, and residents invested in locks, alarms, and vigilance. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next strike. Amid this atmosphere of fear, the police intensified their efforts. Task forces dedicated to the case pooled resources and expertise. Tips poured in, some leading to false alarms, others to new avenues of investigation. One of the breakthroughs came from a survivor who managed to identify Ramirez during an attack. Despite his terrifying presence, the witness remembered distinctive tattoos and mannerisms. This information helped narrow down the suspect pool. Parallel to the official investigation, the media played a powerful role. Sensational headlines and television coverage both informed and alarmed the public. The name Night Stalker became a fixture in the collective consciousness, symbolizing the menace lurking in the shadows. Ramirez's crimes also raised broader questions about societal issues. His background, marked by poverty, family dysfunction, and exposure to violence, highlighted the complexities of understanding and preventing such tragedies. Experts debated the intersections of environment, psychology, and personal choice. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions collaborated. The crime spanned areas from Los Angeles to San Francisco, demanding coordination and communication rarely seen before. Despite the growing evidence and mounting pressure, Ramirez remained at large, continuing his reign of terror. His boldness seemed to escalate, as if emboldened by his own evasion. His eventual capture in August 1985 came through a combination of public vigilance and law enforcement acumen. After attempting to steal a car in East Los Angeles, Ramirez was recognized by residents who had seen his image on the news. They confronted him, restraining him until police arrived. The moment of his arrest was surreal. The man who had terrorized a city brought down not by police alone, but by ordinary citizens who refused to be victims. Following his capture, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place.
Detailed interrogations and investigations confirmed Ramirez as the perpetrator of numerous murders, assaults, and home invasions. The evidence against him was overwhelming: weapons, stolen items from victims, and forensic clues. Survivors identified him with confidence, solidifying the prosecution's case. The trial that followed was one of the most watched in American history. Ramirez's courtroom behavior was erratic and disturbing, marked by apparent delight in the attention and declarations of satanic allegiance. For many, the trial was a painful spectacle, a reopening of wounds, a confrontation with evil made flesh. But it was also a testament to the justice system's determination to hold him accountable. Throughout the proceedings, the stories of victims and survivors were told with care and respect, humanizing those who had been dehumanized by the violence. Experts testified on Ramirez's psychological state, offering insights into his motivations and mental health. While some argued for mitigation, the jury ultimately found him guilty on multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, and other charges. He was sentenced to death, spending the remainder of his life on death row. His death in 2013 from natural causes did little to diminish the impact of his crimes on the families and communities he had shattered. The legacy of Richard Ramirez is a somber reminder of the darkness that can dwell within individuals and the fragility of safety and trust. Yet within that darkness, there are also stories of courage: the survivors who reclaimed their lives, the neighbors who stood together, and the law enforcement officers who pursued justice relentlessly. The Night Stalker case has become a point of reflection for those seeking to understand the roots of violence and the ways society can protect its most vulnerable. In the months following Richard Ramirez's arrest, the city of Los Angeles struggled to come to terms with the dark chapter that had been closed but whose echoes would linger for decades. The terror that Ramirez had inflicted was not easily forgotten. It had pierced the collective sense of safety and trust, and the wounds it left were both physical and psychological. One of the most haunting aspects of the Night Stalker case was the randomness of his attacks, the way any household, no matter how ordinary or well guarded, could suddenly become the stage for horror. This unpredictability meant that anxiety remained deeply rooted, long after Ramirez was behind bars. For many survivors, life after the attacks was a difficult journey marked by trauma, fear, and a desperate search for normalcy. Take, for example, the story of Cynthia and Max, a couple whose home was invaded on a quiet evening. Cynthia, who was only 22 at the time, had been alone in the house when Ramirez forced his way inside. Her courage and composure under unimaginable duress were remarkable. She later testified in court, describing not only the physical violence, but the psychological torment, the way Ramirez wielded fear like a weapon, breaking down her sense of self and safety. Max, returning home later that night, found his wife shaken but alive. The couple's relationship, like many others, was tested by the trauma, but they found ways to support each other, turning to counseling and community support groups. Their story, like many others, reminds us that behind the headlines are real people, their pain, resilience, and sometimes slow, fragile healing. Psychological experts who studied Ramirez sought to unpack the layers of his mind. He was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, a condition characterized by a pervasive disregard for the rights and feelings of others. This diagnosis helped explain his lack of empathy and the cruelty he displayed, but it did not excuse it. Further complicating the picture was Ramirez's fascination with Satanism. His courtroom displays of pentagrams and references to the devil both shocked the public and raised questions about the role of belief systems in his behavior. Some argued these symbols were a form of manipulation, tools to instill fear and create a persona that amplified his notoriety. Others considered the possibility that his belief in darkness was genuine, a manifestation of deeper psychological turmoil. Ramirez's upbringing, marked by abuse and exposure to violence, was also central to understanding his trajectory. His father's harsh discipline and his cousin's graphic war stories created an environment where violence was normalized, even glorified. Experts suggest that this early exposure warped his perception of right and wrong, blurring boundaries that most learn in childhood. His substance abuse, particularly heavy use of cocaine and marijuana, further impaired his judgment and heightened his impulsivity. In some ways, the drugs served as an escape from his own troubled mind, even as they fueled his violent actions. The media frenzy surrounding the Night Stalker created a complex dynamic. On one hand, widespread coverage helped keep the public alert and aided law enforcement by encouraging tips and vigilance. On the other, sensationalism risked amplifying fear and sometimes distorted facts, feeding a narrative of terror that could overshadow the nuanced realities of the victims' experiences. Ramirez's trial became a national spectacle, with courtroom footage and news stories dissecting every detail. For many watching, it was the first time they encountered such raw exposure to violent crime and its consequences. The public grappled with feelings of horror, fascination, and a deep desire to understand how such evil could exist within someone who seemed so ordinary. Throughout the trial, victim impact statements stood out as some of the most powerful moments. Survivors and family members spoke with a mixture of grief and determination, reclaiming their voices in the face of violence designed to silence them. Their courage became a testament to human strength and the will to heal. The legal process itself was long and arduous, spanning over a year. Ramirez faced 13 counts of murder, along with numerous charges of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. His erratic courtroom behavior, including flashing satanic hand signs and laughing, shocked many, but also underscored the dissonance between his public persona and the reality of his crimes. Despite attempts by his defense team to argue for diminished responsibility due to mental illness, the jury convicted Ramirez on nearly all counts. He was sentenced to death in 1989 and sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained until his death in 2013. In prison, Ramirez continued to fascinate and disturb. Some inmates admired his notoriety, while others feared him. He reportedly maintained his allegiance to satanic beliefs, further complicating efforts to understand his psyche. But beyond the man himself, the Night Stalker case had profound effects on law enforcement practices and community awareness. Police departments across California and beyond revisited their approaches to serial crimes, emphasizing the importance of interagency cooperation, forensic advancements, and victim support. One lasting contribution was the increased use of criminal profiling and behavioral analysis, which aimed to anticipate and prevent future attacks by understanding the psychological patterns of offenders like Ramirez. Community programs grew as well, encouraging neighborhoods to work together and watch for signs of suspicious behavior. The sense of isolation that Ramirez exploited was replaced, in many places, by a renewed commitment to collective safety. The families of victims found solace in advocacy and remembrance. Memorials were established, not to glorify violence, but to honor lives lost and to foster healing. Survivors often spoke publicly about their experiences, helping to break stigmas around trauma and emphasizing the importance of mental health support. Ramirez's story, while deeply disturbing, also serves as a case study in the complexities of human behavior. It reminds us that evil is not always monstrous in appearance. It can be hidden beneath a veneer of normalcy, waiting for an opportunity to emerge. The Night Stalker's reign ended, but the scars remain, etched in the memories of those who lived through it, and in the fabric of a city forever changed. His crimes forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about vulnerability, justice, and the capacity for darkness within. Yet in the quiet aftermath, there are also stories of hope. The resilience of survivors, the dedication of law enforcement, and the community's commitment to healing form a counterpoint to the horror, a reminder that even in the darkest shadows, light can endure. The story of Richard Ramirez does not end with his death in 2013. In many ways, it continued to ripple through the lives of those he touched, the city that bore his shadow, and the cultural landscape that struggled to come to terms with the presence of such darkness. His passing from natural causes in a hospital, after years on death row, brought a quiet close to the legal chapter, but the emotional and societal aftermath remains profound. In the years following Ramirez's conviction, the survivors and families of victims faced a long path toward healing. Each person's journey was unique, shaped by personal grief and resilience, and the challenge of reclaiming life from trauma's grip. For some, Therapy and counseling became crucial tools, helping them process memories that remained vivid and painful. Post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression were common companions for those who had narrowly escaped death or lost loved ones. Support groups created safe spaces where people could share their stories without judgment, finding connection amid isolation. One survivor, Dolores, spoke candidly about the enduring impact of Ramirez's attack on her sense of safety. Even decades later, I find myself checking locks multiple times, startled by unexpected sounds, she said. The fear never fully goes away, but I have learned to live with it, and not let it define me. Others, like the family of a young victim, channeled their pain into advocacy. They worked to raise awareness about crime prevention, victim support, and mental health resources. Their efforts created ripples of positive change, turning tragedy into a legacy of hope and action. Law enforcement agencies, too, evolved in response to the lessons of the Night Stalker case. The coordination between departments during Ramirez's pursuit set a precedent for future investigations, emphasizing the importance of communication and information sharing across jurisdictions. Technological advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis and fingerprint databases, became increasingly central to solving cases. The frustrations and delays experienced in Ramirez's time underscored the necessity of investing in these tools to bring perpetrators to justice more efficiently. The psychological profiling techniques developed and refined during the investigation also influenced modern law enforcement. By understanding behavioral patterns and motivations, authorities hoped to anticipate and prevent crimes before they could occur. Yet perhaps one of the most lasting societal impacts was the shift in public awareness. The Night Stalker case shattered the illusion that home was an invulnerable sanctuary. People became more vigilant, communities more connected. Neighborhood watch programs gained momentum, and education on personal safety spread. The collective trauma forged a new culture of caution, a double-edged sword that, while protective, sometimes bred suspicion and anxiety. Media coverage of the case, both at the time and in the years since, has been a delicate balance. Documentaries, books and retrospectives seek to illuminate the facts and honor the victims, but the risk of sensationalism remains. Responsible storytelling requires sensitivity, an acknowledgement that behind every statistic is a person, a family, a network of relationships forever altered. In recent years, the Night Stalker has been the subject of renewed interest, partly due to popular culture and true crime media. Podcasts and series have revisited the case with fresh perspectives, sometimes incorporating new information or exploring the social context more deeply. This renewed attention can serve to keep the memories of victims alive and remind society of the importance of vigilance and compassion. However, it also raises ethical questions about privacy and the potential for re-traumatization. Among the enduring mysteries in the case are the deeper psychological and emotional roots of Ramirez's actions. While experts have offered insights into his diagnosis and background, some questions remain unanswered. What precisely fueled his compulsion to inflict such suffering? How did he reconcile his actions with the self he presented to the world? Did he ever feel remorse or conflict? These questions invite reflection on the nature of evil and the complexities of human psychology. Ramirez's life underscores that while genetics, environment and experience shape behavior, the choices individuals make carry profound consequences. The victims' stories, often overshadowed by the infamy of their attacker, deserve equal attention. They were more than statistics or headlines. They were parents, children, friends, neighbors. Their lives and memories serve as reminders of the preciousness of human connection and the devastating cost when it is shattered by violence. Communities affected by Ramirez's crimes have over time found ways to honor their lost members and rebuild. Annual vigils and memorials mark the passage of time and the resilience of the human spirit. Artistic expressions, poetry, music, visual art, have also become mediums through which survivors and families process grief and assert life's persistence beyond death. In schools and public forums, Discussions about the Night Stalker have become part of broader conversations about safety, mental health, and justice. These dialogues aim not only to remember but also to prevent, creating environments where violence finds fewer footholds. Ultimately, the story of Richard Ramirez is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the depths to which humanity can fall, but also a call to vigilance, empathy, and collective responsibility. The Night Stalker's shadow looms large, but it does not define the city or the people who live within it. Instead, it challenges society to confront darkness without losing sight of light, to honor victims by fostering healing, understanding, and hope.
In the summer of 1976, New York City was a place of restless energy and simmering tensions. The streets buzzed with the sounds of cars, laughter, and occasional sirens, but beneath the surface, a quiet fear was beginning to take hold. Something was stalking the night, a presence that was invisible, unpredictable, and terrifying. David Berkowitz was a man whose name would soon become synonymous with dread. The son of Sam, as the media would come to call him, left a chilling trail across the city, haunting neighborhoods that had once felt safe and familiar. But before the violence, before the headlines, there was a young man whose life was marked by confusion and pain. Born Richard David Falco in 1953, he was later adopted by the Berkowitz family, growing up in a modest home in Yonkers. From an early age, he was described by those who knew him as quiet and awkward, a boy who struggled to find his place. His childhood was a mixture of normal family moments and underlying difficulties, feelings of isolation, a deep sense of not belonging, and early brushes with the darker corners of his mind. As David moved into adolescence, these internal struggles grew. He sought comfort in music, the burgeoning rock scene, and fantasy worlds where he might find a sense of control and identity. Yet, beneath the surface, something was festering, a restless anger, a yearning for significance, and a desire to be noticed, even if that attention came through fear. The city itself was changing. New York in the mid-1970s was a place grappling with crime, economic uncertainty, and social upheaval. The summer heat intensified tempers, and neighborhoods once vibrant now seemed to shrink behind closed doors and locked windows. Into this atmosphere stepped a figure who would shatter any remaining illusions of safety. On the evening of July 29, 1976, the first attack took place in the quiet neighborhood of the Bronx. Donna Lauria, a young woman walking home after a late shift, was shot twice in the back. Miraculously, she survived, but the incident sent ripples through the city. At first it seemed like an isolated act, perhaps a robbery gone wrong, but the pattern soon became unmistakable. Over the following weeks, more attacks occurred. Young couples walking hand in hand in parked cars, individuals returning home after a night out. No one seemed immune. The shootings were random, brutal, and left victims terrified and communities on edge. What made these crimes all the more unnerving was the apparent lack of motive. The perpetrator did not rob or sexually assault. He simply seemed to want to kill, to instill terror. Police investigations intensified, but the killer was elusive. Witnesses described a man of average height, often wearing a baseball cap and dark clothing. His weapon was a .44 caliber bulldog revolver, a choice that added a distinctive signature to his crimes. The media quickly seized on the story, and the name Son of Sam emerged from letters the killer sent to the police and newspapers. In these letters he taunted authorities, boasting about his crimes and hinting at a larger, darker mission. His messages were cryptic and chilling, mixing religious references, personal grievances, and claims of possession by a demonic force. The public fascination grew alongside the fear, with each new letter amplifying the mystery of who this man was and what drove him. Behind the scenes, law enforcement worked tirelessly to decode the clues. Profilers studied the letters, trying to understand the psychology of the killer. The consensus was that the Son of Sam was likely a disturbed individual, possibly suffering from delusions, yet cunning enough to evade capture. The investigation stretched over a year, during which New Yorkers lived in a state of cautious vigilance. Some stopped going out after dark, others traveled in groups or avoided certain neighborhoods. The city's pulse was slowed by the shadow cast by the killer. David Berkowitz, meanwhile, maintained an unassuming facade. Working as a postal clerk, he blended into everyday life, unnoticed even as the city's fear swelled. But on the night of August 10, 1977, everything changed. In the Bronx, a shooting outside an apartment building drew immediate police attention. The bullet had missed its intended target, but the circumstances raised suspicions. Soon after, David Berkowitz was arrested, his weapon in hand. The city exhaled in relief, yet many questions remained. Why had he done it? What had driven this man to terrorize an entire metropolis? In the quiet that followed, as the legal process began, the story of the son of Sam unfolded, a story that would delve into the complexities of mental illness, family dysfunction, and the human capacity for darkness. After his arrest on that August night in 1977, David Berkowitz's world changed dramatically. The city that had been gripped by fear now turned its gaze toward the man who had caused so much pain and disruption. Yet behind the headlines and the growing notoriety, there was a deeper, more complex narrative unfolding, one that sought to understand the forces that shaped Berkowitz's actions and the inner turmoil that had led him down such a dark path. In the interrogation room, Berkowitz was calm, almost detached. He confessed quickly, recounting the details of his attacks with an eerie clarity. What he revealed was a mixture of chilling confession and puzzling contradiction. He claimed that he was driven by a demonic force, a manifestation he referred to as Sam, the devilish entity who had commanded him to kill. This explanation seemed to straddle the line between madness and calculated manipulation. For law enforcement and psychologists alike, Berkowitz presented a challenging enigma. Was he truly possessed by something beyond himself, or was this a constructed narrative, a way to distance himself from responsibility and create a myth around his deeds? To understand this, one had to look deeper into his background. David's childhood had been marked by early instability. Born to a 16-year-old mother who gave him up for adoption, he had grown up in a household where love and attention were inconsistent. His adoptive parents provided a stable environment, but David struggled with feelings of abandonment and isolation. In adolescence, these feelings intensified. He described being bullied at school, feeling invisible to his peers, and seeking solace in fantasy worlds where he could exert control and feel powerful. These early experiences planted seeds of resentment and confusion that would later bloom into darker impulses. Mental health evaluations revealed a complex picture. Berkowitz was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and other personality disorders, conditions that affected his perception of reality and his ability to control impulses. His claims of hearing voices and being commanded to kill fit within these diagnoses, illustrating how mental illness can distort a person's experience of the world. Yet, while mental illness offered some explanation, it did not excuse the harm he had caused. Each attack was a deliberate act that left victims traumatized and communities shattered. The randomness of his targets, often young couples in parked cars, added to the horror, as it underscored the unpredictability and cruelty of his violence. In the courtroom, Berkowitz's demeanor was both somber and detached. He pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder and additional charges of attempted murder and assault. By accepting responsibility, he avoided a prolonged trial, but the public remained fascinated and horrified. The sentencing was swift, 6 consecutive life terms to be served without the possibility of parole. For many, this was a necessary step toward justice, but it also raised questions about rehabilitation, punishment, and the role of mental health treatment in the criminal justice system. Behind the walls of the prison, Berkowitz underwent a transformation that surprised many. He became deeply involved in religious study, embracing born-again Christianity. In interviews and letters, he spoke of repentance, forgiveness, and a desire to atone for his past. This spiritual awakening was seen by some as genuine, a sincere attempt at redemption. Others remained skeptical, wary of such a dramatic shift and the motivations behind it. Meanwhile, the city of New York slowly began to heal. The trauma left by the son of Sam attacks lingered in the collective memory, but life moved forward. Neighborhoods that had once closed their doors after dark reopened, and families resumed their routines. Victims and their loved ones continued their difficult journeys toward recovery. Some spoke publicly about their experiences, advocating for greater awareness of victim support and mental health resources. The impact of the Son of Sam case extended beyond New York. It sparked national conversations about serial killers, media sensationalism, and the responsibilities of law enforcement. The fear generated by the case influenced public policy, leading to increased funding for police departments and new strategies for tracking violent offenders. One lasting legacy was the creation of laws aimed at preventing criminals from profiting from their notoriety, often referred to as Son of Sam laws. These measures sought to ensure that perpetrators could not financially benefit from the publicity generated by their crimes, an ethical response to a complex problem. Psychologically, the case became a touchstone for understanding the interplay between mental illness and criminal behavior. Berkowitz's story challenged simplistic narratives of evil, forcing experts and the public to grapple with uncomfortable questions about nature, nurture, and responsibility. How much of his actions were the result of untreated schizophrenia? To what extent did his environment shape his path? Could intervention have prevented the tragedy? These questions remain difficult to answer definitively, but they highlight the importance of comprehensive mental health care and early support systems. The Son of Sam case also exposed the pitfalls of media coverage in high-profile crimes. Sensational headlines and dramatic speculation sometimes overshadowed the voices of victims and their families. The balance between informing the public and respecting privacy became a topic of ethical debate that continues today. In the quiet moments behind prison bars, Berkowitz reflected on his life. Interviews years later revealed a man burdened by guilt, wrestling with his past and seeking some measure of peace. His admissions of remorse were tempered by acknowledgement of the irreversible harm he had caused. The human cost of his crimes was profound. 6 lives were lost, countless others forever changed by fear and trauma. Yet, amid the darkness, there were glimpses of resilience. Communities rebuilt trust. Victims reclaimed their stories. Society learned difficult lessons about vigilance, compassion, and the complexities of human behavior. David Berkowitz's journey, from troubled youth, to feared killer, to repentant prisoner, remains a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of the fragile boundaries between sanity and madness, safety and danger, light and shadow. The years following David Berkowitz's arrest and conviction did not soften the public's fascination with the man known as the Son of Sam. Even as New York City moved beyond the immediate terror of his attacks, his story continued to echo in conversations, in books, and in the quiet reflections of those whose lives had been touched by his violence. In prison, Berkowitz's existence was one of routine and reflection. The chaotic years of roaming New York streets, armed and dangerous, were replaced by the slow passage of days measured in meals, work assignments, and limited contact with the outside world. But it was in these years of confinement that some of the more profound aspects of his story unfolded. Aspects that peeled back layers of myth and revealed the complex human beneath the headlines. One of the most striking developments was Berkowitz's spiritual transformation. After his conviction, he immersed himself in religious study, claiming that a moment of divine intervention had altered the course of his life. He described a period of deep despair during which he believed he was possessed by an evil force, the Sam who had commanded him to kill, but that through faith he was able to break free. For Berkowitz, this was not merely a tale for public consumption, but a genuine shift in identity. He began to correspond with ministers, write letters expressing remorse, and even work within the prison community to support other inmates seeking spiritual guidance. The authenticity of this transformation was debated outside prison walls. Some viewed it as sincere repentance, a sign that even the darkest souls could seek redemption. Others dismissed it as a calculated attempt to gain favor or reduce sentence length. Yet, regardless of interpretation, Berkowitz's embrace of faith added a layer of complexity to the public's understanding of him. Here was a man who, once a symbol of terror, was now a figure wrestling with conscience and consequence. While Berkowitz adapted to prison life, questions lingered about the full extent of his crimes. The 6 murders to which he pleaded guilty represented only part of the story.
Police and investigators speculated that there might be additional attacks, possibly linked by pattern or weapon, that had gone unconfirmed. These suspicions fed into a broader dialogue about the nature of serial killers, the difficulties in identifying their true scope, the challenges victims faced in coming forward, and the limits of law enforcement in connecting disparate crimes. Over time, Berkowitz participated in interviews that peeled back fragments of his psyche. He spoke about feelings of anger, loneliness, and a desperate desire for significance. He described hearing voices that commanded him to kill, voices that he struggled to resist but ultimately obeyed. Mental health professionals analyzed these statements with a mixture of empathy and clinical detachment. Paranoid schizophrenia, with its hallmark hallucinations and delusions, offered a framework to understand his claims. But the line between genuine psychosis and manipulative storytelling was often blurred. In many ways, Berkowitz embodied the archetype of the conflicted killer, a man caught between his demons and his humanity, whose actions inflicted irreparable harm, yet whose personal story evoked sympathy in some quarters. The victims and their families, however, were less concerned with psychological nuance than with the raw reality of loss. For them, the legal process, the media coverage, and Berkowitz's later remorse could never erase the pain of that summer, the nights forever darkened by fear. Some survivors dedicated themselves to advocacy, pushing for better victim support services and mental health care. Their voices became part of a larger movement seeking to balance justice with compassion, punishment with healing. The city itself bore the scars of those months. In neighborhoods where couples once strolled under the stars, wary glances replaced carefree laughter. Community meetings discussed safety measures, increased lighting, and neighborhood watch programs. The experience left a lingering imprint on New York's collective consciousness. In the years after Berkowitz's conviction, the Son of Sam case influenced law enforcement tactics. Advances in criminal profiling, forensic science, and interagency communication were accelerated by the lessons learned during the hunt for the killer. Still, even as the years passed, questions remained. Was Berkowitz acting entirely alone? Some speculated about accomplices or broader conspiracies, fueled by inconsistencies in his accounts and lingering doubts about the totality of his crimes. Berkowitz himself fueled some of these theories. At various points, he hinted at being part of a larger network or cult, describing shadowy figures who had influenced or directed his actions. These claims were met with skepticism and often dismissed as delusional or self-serving. Yet they added to the enigmatic aura surrounding his case, keeping public interest alive decades after the attacks. From a psychological standpoint, these conflicting narratives highlighted the complexity of Berkowitz's mind. His need to create meaning and structure from chaos, to externalize blame, and to reconcile his violent actions with an emerging conscience all played out in the stories he told. The media, too, grappled with the challenge of portraying Berkowitz responsibly. Sensational headlines had helped fuel public fear, but over time, journalists and documentarians sought to present a more nuanced picture, one that acknowledged the tragedy without glorifying the killer. This shift reflected a broader change in how society understands and discusses serial killers, with greater attention to the victims, more thoughtful exploration of mental health, and caution against turning criminals into celebrities. Throughout the decades, Berkowitz remained imprisoned, a constant presence in the correctional system. Despite his dark past, he became known for good behavior and involvement in prison programs, including counseling others and participating in religious services. Some psychologists studying his case pointed to these behaviors as signs of genuine rehabilitation, or at least an effort at personal reform. Others warned that incarceration alone did not erase the root causes of violence, and that the potential for danger always remained. In the end, Berkowitz's story is one of contradictions, a man capable of horrific violence yet seeking peace, a figure who inspired terror yet expressed remorse, a symbol of evil intertwined with human frailty. His life raises difficult questions about fate, free will, and the nature of evil. How much was shaped by biology, environment, or choice? Can a man who took 6 lives ever find forgiveness, either from society or from himself? These are questions without easy answers, lingering in the quiet spaces where facts end and reflection begins. The decades that followed David Berkowitz's conviction were marked by a slow unraveling of the public's initial fear, replaced by a cautious contemplation of the many layers his story presented. Behind prison walls, Berkowitz's life settled into a rhythm of confinement and contemplation, yet outside, the echoes of his crimes continued to ripple through the lives of victims, their families, and the society that had once lived in constant terror. As the years progressed, Berkowitz became more open in his reflections. Interviews and correspondence revealed a man grappling with the weight of his actions, the consequences that could never be undone. His narrative was one of struggle, a battle between the impulses that once drove him and the remorse that now consumed him. This transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it linear. For a long time after his arrest, Berkowitz's accounts were inconsistent, vacillating between claims of demonic possession and suggestions of complicity with others. Some of these claims fueled speculation about broader conspiracies or cult involvement, which were never substantiated. Such stories, while intriguing, often obscured the harsh reality of his individual responsibility. Psychologists studying his case noted that this shifting narrative might have been a way to cope with guilt and confusion, to distance himself from the horror he had inflicted. It reflected a mind torn between acknowledgement and denial, between self-preservation and penitence. The passage of time brought with it an increasing emphasis on rehabilitation and understanding. Berkowitz embraced his role as a model prisoner, participating actively in religious programs, counseling fellow inmates, and advocating for forgiveness and spiritual renewal. His embrace of born-again Christianity was profound. He spoke often of finding peace through faith, and of the hope that even the darkest souls could change. His story became part of a broader dialogue about redemption, what it meant for those who had committed terrible crimes, and how society could balance justice with mercy. Some victims and family members found solace in Berkowitz's repentance, believing that acknowledgement and remorse were steps toward healing. Others remained skeptical, wary of any attempt to soften the image of a man who had caused so much pain. The city of New York, once gripped by the Son of Sam's reign of terror, had itself transformed. The neighborhoods that had been silent with fear gradually reclaimed their life and vibrancy. Streets that had been deserted after dusk again filled with voices and footsteps. Yet the memory lingered, woven into the fabric of the city's history. For many New Yorkers, the Son of Sam was a reminder of vulnerability, how quickly safety could be shattered, how the unknown could invade the familiar. The attacks prompted improvements in policing, community engagement, and awareness of mental health issues. On a societal level, Berkowitz's crimes influenced policy as well. The so-called Son of Sam laws were enacted to prevent criminals from profiting off the publicity surrounding their crimes, a measure born from a concern that notoriety could serve as a reward for violence. These laws sparked legal debates about free speech and rights, underscoring the complicated intersection between justice and individual freedoms. The legacy of the Son of Sam case also lived on in the fields of criminal psychology and law enforcement. His case became a textbook example for profiling violent offenders, understanding the mind of a serial killer, and examining the role of mental illness in criminal behavior. But for all the academic interest, the story remained fundamentally about human lives altered, 6 individuals whose deaths left families shattered and communities scarred. Each victim had their own story beyond the headlines. They were young couples seeking moments of privacy or tenderness, caught tragically in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their memories persisted in the hearts of loved ones who fought to honor their lives rather than allow them to be overshadowed by the killer's infamy. Victim advocacy groups grew stronger, pushing for improved support systems, counseling services, and legal protections. Their work reminded society that behind statistics and sensationalism, there were real people struggling to rebuild. Berkowitz himself remained confined, an ever-present figure in the criminal justice system. His life in prison was a stark contrast to his days of violent freedom. Yet within that confined space, he sought a different kind of liberation, one from guilt, from anger, and from the darkness that had once consumed him. Letters he wrote to the press and to victims' families expressed sorrow and a desire for forgiveness, though he acknowledged that some wounds would never heal. He spoke of the burden of living with the consequences of his actions, a weight heavier than any prison sentence. His reflections contributed to a growing understanding of the complexities of criminal behavior. They highlighted the intersection of mental illness, trauma, and personal responsibility. And they forced society to grapple with uncomfortable truths, that evil can arise from brokenness, and that justice is not always simple or absolute. The Son of Sam story remains a haunting chapter in America's history, a tale of terror and tragedy, but also of human complexity, and the possibility, however faint, of redemption. In the quiet moments when the city's lights dim and the noise fades, the memories linger. They serve as a reminder of the fragility of safety, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring search for meaning in the face of darkness. David Berkowitz's life is a somber meditation on how one individual's pain and madness can ripple outward, touching countless others. It challenges us to look beyond fear and hatred, to seek understanding without excusing harm, and to remember those who were lost always.
In the quiet towns and college campuses of the American Northwest during the 1970s, a calm surface hid a growing darkness, one that would soon disrupt countless lives and leave a haunting legacy that still lingers. This was the world into which Theodore Robert Bundy entered, a man whose outward charm and intelligence concealed a capacity for unthinkable violence. Born in 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Bundy's early life was complicated by secrets and contradictions. Raised by his grandparents, he was led to believe for much of his childhood that his mother was his sister, a deception that would shape his sense of identity and belonging. The confusion and instability of his early years sowed seeds of psychological turmoil, a fracture between the persona he projected and the internal struggle he carried. As he moved through adolescence, Bundy appeared to many as a bright and ambitious young man. He attended the University of Washington, studying psychology and political science, and was often described as personable, articulate, and engaging. Friends and acquaintances admired his confidence, wit, and apparent kindness. But beneath this polished exterior, a darker impulse began to emerge. The early 1970s marked the start of a string of disappearances and attacks across the Pacific Northwest, particularly in Washington and Oregon. Women, often young, vulnerable, and alone, vanished without a trace. Their disappearances were initially puzzling, isolated incidents that police struggled to connect, but as the number of victims grew, a pattern slowly became evident. A man who approached women by feigning injury or disability, asking for assistance or directions, only to overpower them once trust was gained. His method was chillingly calculated, an ability to manipulate, to disarm suspicion with a smile and an outstretched hand. The victims were not random. There was a disturbing consistency in his targets, young women with long hair parted in the middle, often wearing similar styles of clothing. This specific preference suggested a fixation that went beyond mere opportunity. One of the earliest known victims was Karen Sparks, a college student in Seattle who escaped after a brutal assault. Her survival was a rare exception amid a growing list of tragedies, and her testimony offered some of the first glimpses into the predator's methods. Police began to piece together witness descriptions, noting a man with a strong jawline, dark hair, and a casual, approachable demeanor. But identifying the perpetrator proved difficult. Bundy's ability to blend into his surroundings, to present as an ordinary man, confounded investigators. The 1970s were a time of changing social landscapes, with increased independence among young women and evolving norms. Yet the vulnerability that accompanied these changes was exploited by a man who understood the art of deception. As Bundy's crimes escalated, so too did the sense of unease in communities from Seattle to Salt Lake City, and eventually as far as Colorado and Florida. He became a figure of nightmares, a shadow moving through the night, leaving devastation in his wake. Despite the growing body of evidence, law enforcement faced challenges. Bundy was not a typical profile, not the visibly menacing figure many imagined a killer to be. Instead, he was intelligent, careful, and adaptable. His knowledge of law enforcement tactics, gleaned in part from his own studies and time volunteering at a crisis hotline, gave him an edge. Several times, Bundy narrowly escaped capture. He was arrested in 1975 in Utah on suspicion of kidnapping, but managed to convince officers of his innocence. At another point, he was pulled over in Colorado with suspicious items in his car, but again avoided detention. Behind the headlines and investigations was a deeper mystery. What drove this man to such darkness? Psychologists and criminologists would later analyze his background, the fractured family, the feelings of rejection, the possible personality disorders, but at the time, these insights were limited. What was clear, however, was that Bundy's crimes were becoming more brazen, more violent. The facade of the affable young man was breaking down to reveal a predator capable of cruelty beyond imagination. By the summer of 1974, the focus of his crimes shifted toward the Florida State University campus. Here, the sense of security was shattered by a series of attacks so sudden and brutal that they left the community reeling. His first known Florida victim, Linda Ann Healy, disappeared from her off-campus house one evening. In the following weeks, several other young women vanished under similar circumstances, each case chillingly similar in its pattern of abduction and violence. The authorities mounted extensive investigations, issuing warnings and alerts, but Bundy remained elusive. His ability to operate across state lines complicated jurisdictional efforts, and his manipulative nature allowed him to evade suspicion. It was during this time that Bundy's double life became most apparent. To friends, he was the devoted boyfriend of Carol Ann Boone, someone capable of warmth and connection. To his victims, he was a figure of terror. This dichotomy perplexed those who knew him, and continues to puzzle those who study his case. How could one man embody such extremes, the charisma that drew people close, and the darkness that drove him to destroy? As the net tightened, Bundy's story began to unfold publicly, capturing the imagination and horror of the nation. Newspapers and television carried his image into millions of homes, warning of the danger lurking beneath familiar faces. The son of charm, as some called him, was a stark reminder that evil often hides in plain sight. As the summer of 1974 stretched on, the fear that had gripped communities from the Pacific Northwest to Florida deepened. The series of disappearances and assaults linked to Ted Bundy were not only growing in number, but also in the brutality with which they were carried out. The quiet streets and college campuses, once places of safety and discovery, were becoming scenes of suspicion and dread. Bundy's ability to operate across such a wide geographic area made him especially difficult to track. In an era before digital databases and rapid interstate communication between law enforcement agencies, the coordination necessary to connect the dots was often slow and incomplete. Investigators in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida were often unaware of the full extent of his movements and crimes. Bundy exploited this fragmentation, moving fluidly from place to place, adapting his tactics, and slipping through the cracks. One of the defining aspects of Bundy's methods was his manipulation of perception. He understood deeply the psychology of trust and used it to his advantage. His strategy often began with an act of vulnerability. He would approach young women in public spaces, feigning injury, or asking for help carrying a package, or pushing a broken arm in a makeshift sling. His disarming smile, combined with an air of casual confidence, encouraged compassion. Many victims later described feeling a strange mix of sympathy and suspicion, but never enough to avert their fatal trust. This tactic was chillingly effective. The small kindnesses and the well-crafted facade allowed him to lure victims away from safety, to isolated places where he could overpower them with calculated violence. His crimes often involved abduction from homes, dormitories, or outdoor areas at night, where the shadows helped conceal his presence. One of the most harrowing moments came on the night of February 1, 1975, in Colorado, when Bundy was arrested for the first time in connection with his attacks. After pulling over for a minor traffic violation, police found suspicious items in his car, a crowbar, handcuffs and masks, all tools that hinted at his sinister intentions. Yet, due to procedural errors and Bundy's convincing explanations, he was released. This near miss reinforced the idea that Bundy was not only cunning, but had developed a deep understanding of how to manipulate authority figures and the legal system. His self-assuredness allowed him to navigate situations that would have led other criminals to quick capture. In the months that followed, Bundy's attacks escalated further. On January 12, 1974, the brutal assault on Cheryl Thomas in Washington state marked a turning point. She survived a vicious beating and was able to provide a description of her attacker. Her courage in reporting and identifying Bundy was a rare act of resistance against a predator who thrived on silence. The pattern of attacks became more violent, and the body count increased. Bundy's crimes began to inspire both horror and fascination. Journalists and law enforcement officials grappled with the challenge of explaining a killer who defied easy categorization. He was neither the monstrous brute many imagined, nor a faceless shadow. He was someone who could smile in public, hold a job, and blend in with the everyday crowd. By mid-1975, Bundy was living in Utah and attending law school, further complicating the image people had of him. To many, he seemed on the path to a respectable future. But beneath this veneer, his violent impulses continued unchecked. In June 1975, Bundy abducted and attacked 2 women at a park in Utah. One of the victims, Carolyn, fought fiercely and escaped, providing police with vital information. Yet again, Bundy managed to evade capture. The following month, he struck again, this time in a campground near Salt Lake City. His method was increasingly brazen, approaching victims in public spaces during the day, using his charm and apparent harmlessness to disarm suspicion. As authorities pieced together witness statements, they began to suspect that a single individual was responsible for a series of assaults and disappearances spanning several states. Yet without physical evidence or a solid lead, the investigation remained frustratingly out of reach. The summer of 1975 also saw Bundy's personal life take shape in ways that confused those around him. He began dating Carol Ann Boone, a woman who would later become both his partner and an unexpected participant in his story. Boone saw a different side of Bundy, kind, attentive and seemingly devoted, a stark contrast to the man responsible for so much pain. This dichotomy baffled many and highlighted the terrifying complexity of Bundy's personality. His ability to compartmentalize, to live 2 lives simultaneously, underscored the chilling reality that evil could wear a mask of normalcy. The fall of 1975 brought a dramatic turn. Bundy was arrested in Utah on suspicion of kidnapping Carol DeRonch, a woman who had escaped his attack. This time, the evidence against him was stronger, and he was held in custody. But Bundy's story was far from over. In a stunning display of cunning, Bundy managed to escape from custody twice in 1977. His first escape was from a courthouse in Colorado, where he jumped from a second-story window and vanished into the night. For 6 days he roamed free before being recaptured. His second escape, later that year, was even more audacious. From a jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, he slipped out through a hole he had chipped away in the ceiling of his cell, then climbed down a series of pipes and ropes he had fashioned. For months, he evaded capture, moving through Colorado and Utah. During this time, Bundy's crimes continued. In early 1978, after fleeing to Florida, he committed a series of attacks that shocked the nation. On the campus of Florida State University and the nearby Chi Omega sorority house, Bundy's violence reached new heights of brutality. He murdered at least 5 young women in these attacks, each crime marked by terrifying violence and a disturbing level of cruelty. The Florida attacks revealed a new dimension of Bundy's depravity. No longer was he simply a manipulative predator. He was a remorseless killer who would stop at nothing to fulfill his dark urges. Law enforcement agencies across states finally began to connect the dots, recognizing that Bundy was responsible for crimes spanning nearly a decade. His arrest in Florida in 1978 brought relief but also a sobering awareness of the full extent of his atrocities. The trial that followed was one of the most sensational in American history. Bundy represented himself, using his intelligence and charm in a courtroom that became a stage for his manipulations.
Despite his attempts to control the narrative, the evidence was overwhelming. The testimony of survivors, the accounts of families, and the details of his own confessions painted a portrait of a man consumed by darkness, yet aware enough to exploit every advantage. As the verdict was delivered, guilty on multiple counts of murder, the weight of justice settled over a case that had haunted so many. But even behind bars, Bundy's story was far from complete. His confessions to additional crimes, his reflections on his actions, and his eventual execution in 1989, added new chapters to a tale that had forever altered the landscape of American crime. Through it all, the victims remained at the center, young women whose lives were stolen, families who struggled with grief, and communities left to reckon with the scars left behind. Ted Bundy's story is one of chilling contradictions, a man whose outward appearance belied the horror within. It is a reminder of the complexities of evil, the depths of human darkness, and the enduring need for justice and understanding. The years following Ted Bundy's dramatic escape to Florida were marked by a tense, relentless pursuit of truth and justice. As the full scope of his crimes began to emerge, investigators, survivors, and families struggled to make sense of the chaos he had wrought, and to understand how a man who could appear so ordinary had caused so much devastation. Bundy's capture in February 1978 brought a momentary sense of relief to a public long haunted by his name. Yet the trial and investigation that followed uncovered a darkness far deeper than many had imagined. The crimes he committed in Florida, in particular, revealed a new level of horror, a series of brutal murders that shocked even those who had been tracking him for years. One of the most harrowing chapters in Bundy's Florida crimes was the attack on the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, Bundy entered the sorority house armed with a crowbar. His method was chillingly consistent. He used the element of surprise, overwhelming force, and a cold, calculated brutality. The attack left 2 young women dead, and 2 others severely injured. Bundy had killed Margaret Bowman and Lisa Livy, and critically wounded Kathy Kleiner and Carolyn Roberts. The physical and emotional scars these survivors bore were immense, and their testimonies became central to the prosecution's case against Bundy. Carolyn Roberts, who was beaten and left for dead, survived by sheer force of will. Her memory of the attack was fragmented by trauma, but vital for the investigation. Survivors like Carolyn and Kathy Kleiner embodied the resilience that would help bring Bundy to justice. Their courage in facing their attacker in court, recounting the brutal details of their assaults, gave voice to the countless others silenced by Bundy's violence. In the months following the Chi Omega attack, Bundy's reign of terror continued. He abducted and murdered an 11-year-old girl, Kimberly Leach, in February 1978, in a crime that added a new dimension of horror to his case. The murder of a child shattered the illusion that Bundy's victims were limited to young women on college campuses. It was a stark reminder that his violence was indiscriminate and far-reaching. As Bundy's trial in Florida approached, the public and media attention intensified. The courtroom became a stage not only for legal proceedings, but also for a disturbing display of Bundy's manipulative personality. Bundy insisted on representing himself, a decision that baffled many but reflected his confidence and desire for control. Throughout the trial, Bundy alternated between charm and menace. His polite, articulate demeanor often unsettled jurors and observers alike. He employed tactics designed to intimidate and confuse, challenging witnesses and questioning the validity of evidence. But the overwhelming weight of testimony, physical evidence, and survivor accounts left little room for doubt. The prosecution meticulously detailed Bundy's movements and crimes, presenting a narrative that stretched back years and spanned multiple states. They painted a portrait of a calculated, methodical killer who preyed on young women with terrifying efficiency. One of the key moments in the trial was the testimony of jurors and witnesses regarding Bundy's attacks and the physical evidence linking him to the crimes. Fibers found on victims, bite marks that matched Bundy's dental impressions, and eyewitness accounts formed a compelling web of proof. Despite his efforts to control the proceedings, Bundy's trial culminated in a guilty verdict on charges of murder. The sentence was death, a final judgment on a life marked by violence and manipulation. While Bundy awaited execution on Florida's death row, he began to provide further insight into his crimes. In a series of interviews and confessions, he admitted to killing more women than had been officially attributed to him, revealing the staggering scale of his actions. These confessions offered a glimpse into Bundy's psyche, though they did little to fully explain his motivations. He described a compulsion, a darkness he claimed to struggle against, but his accounts were inconsistent and often self-serving. Psychologists and criminal profilers examined Bundy's case closely, seeking to understand the roots of his behavior. His childhood was scrutinized for clues, his complicated family dynamics, feelings of abandonment, and early signs of deviance. Yet even with extensive analysis, Bundy remained a complex and elusive figure. Some experts argued that Bundy's crimes were driven by deep-seated anger and a desire for control. Others pointed to his narcissism and lack of empathy as central to his pathology. What remained clear was the profound impact his actions had on those around him: victims, families, communities, and the criminal justice system. As the years passed, Bundy's execution date approached. The anticipation was accompanied by a mix of emotions: relief that justice might finally be served, sorrow for the lives lost and forever altered, and lingering questions about the nature of evil. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. His final moments were marked by a quiet acceptance, a stark contrast to the violence he had inflicted. The execution brought closure to one chapter, but left a legacy that continues to resonate. Bundy's story serves as a haunting reminder of the complexity of human nature, the capacity for charm and horror, for manipulation and vulnerability. His crimes changed how law enforcement approached serial offenders, leading to improvements in communication, profiling, and victim support. Yet amid the analysis and reflection, the heart of the story remains the victims, young women whose lives were cut short, or forever changed by Bundy's violence. Their names, their stories, and their courage endure as a testament to resilience in the face of unimaginable darkness. This chapter of American crime history challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about violence and evil. It invites ongoing reflection on justice, empathy, and the fragility of safety. Bundy's legacy is not only a cautionary tale, but also a call to remember the humanity behind every crime, the people whose stories must never be forgotten. In the quiet moments following Ted Bundy's execution, the echoes of his crimes lingered, not only in courtrooms and police records, but more poignantly, in the lives of those forever marked by his violence. The passage of time did little to soften the sharp edges of grief and trauma experienced by victims' families, survivors, and entire communities. It was within these spaces, where loss intertwined with resilience, that Bundy's enduring legacy revealed itself most deeply. Bundy's execution closed a grim chapter in the history of American crime, yet it did not erase the profound emotional and psychological impact of his actions. For the families of the young women he murdered, the trial and sentencing could never fully restore what was lost. The memory of their daughters, sisters, and friends was a living testament, one that demanded remembrance beyond headlines or legal verdicts. Several survivors, including those who had escaped the fatal grasp of Bundy's attacks, spent years grappling with the aftermath. Kathy Kleiner and Carolyn Roberts, both grievously injured during the Chi Omega sorority house attack, navigated physical healing alongside psychological recovery. Their stories, often shared in quiet interviews and survivor advocacy, highlighted the profound strength required to reclaim life after such trauma. Carolyn Roberts spoke candidly about the enduring shadow cast by Bundy's violence. She described the years following her attack as a struggle to regain normalcy amid recurring fear and nightmares. The trauma extended beyond the physical wounds. It was an invisible weight that shaped her relationships, sense of safety, and trust in the world. Kathy Kleiner's journey reflected a similar complexity. After the attack, she returned to college, determined to rebuild her life despite ongoing physical and emotional challenges. She later spoke about the support she found in survivor networks, counseling, and advocacy work, channels through which she transformed her pain into purpose. For many families, the public nature of Bundy's crimes and trial was a double-edged sword. On one hand, The extensive media coverage brought awareness to the dangers posed by such offenders and underscored the need for systemic change. On the other, it often re-traumatized loved ones and survivors, who were forced to relive horrific details in the glare of public scrutiny. The trial itself was unprecedented in its scale and intensity. Bundy's choice to represent himself while shocking became a crucial moment, revealing his manipulative character. He attempted to control the narrative, sidestepping accountability through legal theatrics and psychological gamesmanship. Yet the combined force of forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and the meticulous work of investigators dismantled his defenses. During the trial, Bundy's behavior oscillated between calculated charm and unsettling aggression. This duality puzzled and unnerved observers. How could a man who displayed such a personable and articulate exterior commit such brutal crimes? The tension between Bundy's facade and his monstrous actions became a central theme in understanding his case. Psychologists who studied Bundy after his arrest suggested that his behavior reflected a deeply fractured personality. Diagnoses such as antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy were commonly cited to explain his lack of empathy, impulsivity, and manipulative tendencies. Yet no diagnosis could fully capture the nuances of his violence, or the way he embodied a chilling blend of intelligence and cruelty. Bundy's confessions, made intermittently over the years, added another layer of complexity. While he admitted to 30 homicides across several states, some investigators believed the true number could be higher. Bundy's inconsistent storytelling and desire to maintain some measure of control over his narrative made it difficult to discern fact from self-serving fiction. His confessions also revealed moments of self-reflection and apparent remorse, though experts debated the sincerity of these expressions. Some interpreted them as attempts to negotiate with the system, seeking attention or delaying execution. Others believed they offered rare glimpses into the mind of a deeply troubled man confronting his own darkness. The execution itself was carried out with solemn finality on January 24, 1989, in Florida's electric chair. Bundy's last words were reported to be a simple acknowledgement. "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." There was no dramatic outburst, no final protest, just a quiet end to a life that had inflicted untold pain. In the years since Bundy's death, his story has remained a source of both fascination and horror. Books, documentaries and academic studies have explored every facet of his crimes, personality and trial. This ongoing attention reflects society's desire to understand the nature of evil and the warning signs of violent behavior. Yet amid this fascination, there is a crucial need to remember the victims, not as statistics or sensational stories, but as individuals with lives, dreams and families shattered by violence. Each name, each face lost to Bundy's actions, represents a unique tragedy that resists being overshadowed by the infamy of their killer. The families of Bundy's victims have spoken publicly about the importance of honoring their loved ones' memories with dignity. Memorials, scholarships and advocacy work serve as living legacies, aimed at preventing future tragedies and supporting survivors of violence. In a broader context, Bundy's case had significant implications for law enforcement and criminal justice. His crimes underscored the need for better interstate communication, improved profiling techniques, and enhanced victim support services. Agencies began collaborating more closely, developing databases and task forces specifically designed to track serial offenders. The Bundy case also highlighted the importance of trauma-informed approaches to investigations and trials. The experiences of survivors demonstrated that trauma shapes memory and behavior in complex ways, requiring sensitivity and patience from legal and mental health professionals. Reflecting on Ted Bundy's story invites us to confront uncomfortable realities, that evil can hide behind a mask of normalcy, that trauma can have lasting, invisible effects, and that justice, while essential, cannot undo the past. It reminds us of the vital importance of compassion, vigilance and community in addressing and preventing violence. As society continues to grapple with the legacy of serial killers like Bundy, there remains a quiet but persistent hope that through understanding and remembrance, healing is possible. that the voices of victims and survivors will not be lost amid the shadows cast by infamy, and that in honoring their stories, we can build a future where safety, empathy and justice prevail.